Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relatives Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in the earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you. In 1990, the world was given a movie that would change not only the fabric of cinema, but also the holiday season as we would forever know it. The beloved film we know as Home Alone made its debut and immediately became the highest-grossing live-action comedy in the world. This movie, while iconic for its stunts, antagonistic characters, and the perfect soundtrack, yes? Yes. It's also prolific in its screenwriting, leaving audiences with unforgettable lines like, "Kevin!" and "Merry Christmas, ya filthy animal." Now, before I go any further, I know what you're thinking. A Christmas movie in July, pretty lame. What are you doing to us? Is this your summer attitude? I don't know. Come on, we just celebrated the 4th. Whatever. I don't know what you're feeling, but I just want to name it for the room and just say to you in response to that thought, what is more American than Home Alone? Yeah? Anyway, my point here is that every well-written script is marked by a few transcendent moments like the ones I just mentioned. But a great script's finest marker is when the audience knows the story is coming to an end even before the climactic finale. Exhibit A. Catherine O'Hara sits in the back of a moving truck. John Candy beside her with the festive tunes of the holidays being played by the Kenosha Kickers, the polka kings of the Midwest. This scene is both forgettable and unforgettable. Because up until this moment, we've seen Kate McAllister, played by O'Hara, travel first class to Paris. We've seen her pay big bucks and give away fancy, dangly earrings for the finest or the fastest flight back to her son. But now, in great contrast to her past affluent travel conditions, she is roughing it. She is traveling in potentially unsafe conditions and very much without any type of comfort or even a seatbelt, surrounded by polka, the poor man's jazz. And it's this scene where we find her just hours away from the redemptive reunion with her son that she's been longing for. Forgettable and unforgettable. This is how we lean into the story up until its great ending. Now, this is the kind of writing that we see in Ruth chapter 4. Our author, he zooms in on the forgettable yet unforgettable moment where we, as the audience, know we're just moments away from the happy ending we've been longing for. Ruth and Boaz, our two leading characters, have officially found love on a grain pile. Romance and redemption are in the air. All the cards are on the table, and marriage is their aim. And yet, if you listen close enough, you'll find that they too have the melody of polka music in the distance, reminding us, the audience, that we're not quite to the end of the story. Now, if you're just joining us, we are coming up to the end of the plot of Ruth. This is a short little book that holds the whole of the Bible in 4 chapters and 3 characters. And as of today, we're officially approaching the happy ending, the great finale of the story we've been journeying through together. But just like any good drama, we'll see that the ending we're hoping for won't come without a bit of a fight. Now, last week, the camera zoomed in on our beloved heroine, Ruth, who risked it all for love in the hopes not only of marriage, but redemption for both her and her mother-in-law, Naomi. Now, this week, our scene opens and the cameras move to our hero, Boaz. And he is at City Hall. I want you to picture Costner in a bolo tie displaying formal wear that reads down to earth, yet wealthy, with a solid 401k and a few investments on the side. Now, you remember that at the end of chapter 3, we were told that while love was in bloom, the courthouse was actually the next step for these two. Because redemption could only come if Boaz was given the rights to redeem both Ruth, played by the beautiful Catherine Zeta-Jones, obviously, and Naomi, who could only be played by the very best Meryl Streep. Tyler gave you Costner. I had to give you the other two. So we've got Boaz at the courthouse, and the fight he's facing is that there is someone who is closer to Naomi and Ruth who has more legal rights to redeem them than he does. They have a closer guardian redeemer. Now, just a refresher, a guardian redeemer was someone who could take in and provide for and restore land to a widow who has lost theirs, which would be the equivalent of losing financial independence or the ability to provide for yourself. In short, a guardian redeemer was someone who could buy back protection or provision for a family member who had lost it due to death or a tragedy. And all of this was done through marriage. So, our scene is set. Boaz, in the bolo tie, makes his way downtown, but he doesn't do so without a plan. This is Act 4, the wedding. Now, we're going to look at this act in 3 scenes. The first, old so-and-so. Second, witnesses. And third, a replay of redemption. You ready? It's going to happen no matter what. First up, old so-and-so. Now, at the beginning of our chapter, Boaz finds himself at the town gate. That's what we read, or it's like a city hall. And it's there that his plan begins to unfold. Boaz invites this guardian redeemer, the one closest to Ruth and Naomi, to come sit down beside him. And if you're reading this even just a little bit, you can tell he does so with a bit of sass. Everybody loves a man with a bit of sass, yeah? Just me? Great. Anyway, Boaz starts this conversation with this man, and he calls him, if you read it in your scriptures, right, you can look down, friend. He says, come sit by me, friend, which in the Hebrew is the word poloni almoni. Can you say that? Poloni almoni. It sounds like a beef sandwich or something, but anyway, that's the Hebrew that I'm butchering. I apologize, Tim, if you're in the room. All that to say, this word friend, at least to us, seems benign, but if you read it in the Hebrew, it's actually translated so-and-so. Or in modern English, it would be something along the lines of Joe Schmo. So I'm going to speak to this more in just a moment, but hold that in your mind. Now, Boaz invites 10 of the other elders to sit with him and old so-and-so and to listen. And basically to be witnesses as he tells this guardian redeemer, old so-and-so, that there's an opportunity for him to redeem land from his long-lost relative Elimelech, if he wants to. Now, this opportunity, or better maybe said, responsibility, would have been familiar both to old so-and-so and the people sitting at the town gate. In Deuteronomy 25, we read that the Hebrew law states that it's the responsibility of the closest family member to redeem both the name and the land of a widow, so that the family name would continue on and it wouldn't be blotted out from the story of Israel. So, our Boaz, he knew this. He makes his appeal, and he does so not just to the compassion of this man's heart or the pockets that could be filled, but to the responsibility he actually has to the family. This is a strong move from our Costner. And it doesn't take long to see old so-and-so say, I'm doing it. So-and-so says I'm in, and for those of us who are reading it, at least at the pace we should be, it looks like game over, unless you are playing the long game. Boaz, in verse 5, he drops this line. He says, oh, and on the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. So-and-so and the listeners, at this point, they would have hyperlinked again back to Deuteronomy 25, where they would read that in order for a guardian redeemer to fulfill his duty in preserving the family name, he'd not only have to purchase the land, but again, marry the nearest relative. And this was Boaz's 1-2 punch. He knew this would seal the deal. Immediately, the guardian redeemer counts the cost, and as suspected by our hero Boaz, it's just too great for him. Basically, he says, I'd be in, but this isn't going to be financially great for me. If I have to feed 2 more mouths, it's a bit much, so I'm out. Honestly, sounds like a real Brad Pitt to me. Anyway, the truth is, in this moment, though it seems so benign to us, so simple to us, there's a lot to pay attention to. There's a lot to let the author draw our attention to. So I just want to draw our attention to one of those things. It's here that we have this Redeemer, and he has all this potential to redeem. And not just to redeem Naomi's story, which was tragic, but he has this opportunity to redeem Ruth's story as well. But the rub is that it's just going to cost him too much. Now, if you're a reader of the scriptures, this story shouldn't sound too unfamiliar to you, at least the basics of it. Because just on the other side of your Bible lives another story that is equally as frustrating and disappointing. In Mark chapter 10, we see that there's an opportunity given to a rich young man by Jesus himself. And the opportunity is to participate in the kingdom, but the ask of letting go of money, of possessions, of security, in the name of kingdom goodness, it was just way too much for him. You know this, but what we value shapes how we live. And it shapes how we get to participate in the kingdom. So driven by his truest and highest value, we see that this guardian redeemer, in contrast to our Boaz, actually hoards his riches. He doesn't share them. He hoards food and future food from the table as Boaz feeds and has already fed without hesitation. The contrast of these two men. And if we zoom out, we see that this so-and-so not only missed out on his own redemption, but also on participating in the redemption and the renewal of all things. The name of so-and-so may simply seem like a nod by our author to a nameless character, but this writer was calling out so much more than that. We've seen him or her do that throughout this whole storyline. Just like with Milan and Kilion in chapter 1, we are meant to see and even understand something about this character based on his name. And it's this. It is that he is both forgettable and unmentionable. In this moment, the author is drawing our attention, though subtly, to the fact that this guy missed out, and that we can too. The guardian redeemer, he had this opportunity to have his name, not Boaz's name, but his name at the center of history, of God's redemptive story, to have his name written in the Messiah's genealogy, but just like Orpah, he opted out. And he wasn't a bad guy for doing this per se, but he was someone who valued personal cost over kingdom goodness. He was someone who let his desire for lesser things and momentary costs keep him from experiencing the greatest thing with eternal value. In Act 1, old so-and-so misses out on God's goodness, but that doesn't stop the story. Scene 2, witnesses. Now, if you look at verse 9, look down at your Bibles with me. We got Boaz, and I gotta tell you, this guy is hyped in this moment. This man is saying these words with his chest. Right away, we see that he announces, as soon as the deal's done, by the way, I should reference the shoe. I just don't have time for all the comedic brilliance I want to offer to you about that. Just think of a shoe as a pen to sign a document that basically says I'm out. Got it? But laugh a little bit. So, the shoe, it's crazy. Okay. All right, so Boaz moves on, he signs the deed, and this man's hyped. I am redeeming the two women that I want to, and you're all witnesses to the fact that I've not only redeemed them, but the family name, and I got the girl. Catherine Zeta-Jones leaps into Costner's arms. Aerosmith, I don't want to close my eyes. Playing in the background, and we've got a moment, the moment that we've all been waiting for in the story. This is it. Kissing, hugging totally appropriately, but passionately together. Our two characters have found love. Now, it seems like that would be enough to close the curtain and move on. But just like the master he or she is, this master writer or author, they actually have something more in store for us. Because 3 times in these 4 verses, we find this word witness or witnesses, which is our clue as the reader to ask the question, what are they witnesses to? Now, at face value, it's easy to say, well, obviously this marriage, this purchase of the land, the redemption of Elimelech's name, and yes, those things are true, but what else? What are we meant to see here? Well, a few things, but again, I'm going to hone in on just one of those. We have to go back to verse 10 if we want to get this full picture of what the author's drawing our attention to. So take a look at that with me. It's here that Boaz states that he has acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as his wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. To us, super basic, honestly, snooze fest statement. And it wouldn't catch most of our attentions because we don't actually know what's taking place here. But let me explain to you what Boaz is doing. It's in this moment that he is slowing things down and saying that beyond marrying this woman and beyond redeeming the land, I am also redeeming Mahlon's name, making his name that was once associated with sickness or sicko, do you remember that? Now associated with inheritance or blessing. Boaz, he was under no obligation to perpetuate the name of this dead man. But in this moment, Costner, with the sun pouring on his face and integrity coursing through his veins, he vows to do so anyway, by promising that his son would inherit Elimelech's place and that he would ultimately preserve Elimelech's line. Now, are you still with me? Good, because I'm getting to the big idea here, and it's this. This moment is about resurrection. Raising up the name of the dead. Raising up a family on the verge of death. This, reader, is meant to draw our imagination to the reality that God is not just renewing things with this small family in this small town, this one moment in history, but it is pointing to the reality that God is actually renewing all things. That he would redeem and rescue his people, and he would do so through resurrection. Dead things coming back to life, names being restored, things you thought were forever gone, impossible, now possible. That's what we're seeing here in this very bizarre, odd moment. And it's through this act of generosity, but more so love, we see not just a personal, but a cosmic story unfolding in the middle of this old, small town city hall. Boaz, one picture of one who opts into kingdom work and redemption, he now puts on display in this tiny act the great plan of the kingdom itself. So what are the people and the elders witnesses to? Resurrection. And that's something we can't miss. Boaz is painting more fully a picture of what Yahweh is like and what he would do in the world. And this image sets us up for our final moments in the story. Now in verse 11, our author begins to tie up everything. And he or she does so not with a bow, but with a very unique blessing. In response to what they've just seen, the resurrection of this family, the people or the witnesses begin to bless specifically Ruth. And they do so by naming two famous Jewish matriarchs, Rachel and Leah. You should read the story. It's a little, but let me give you the main points here. These are two women who at the end of their stories were marked by strength and belovedness. Two women who were empty at the start of their story, but then filled again by the goodness and redemption of Yahweh. So this blessing, it makes sense for our Ruth, and it reads really well on the pages of our story. But Rachel and Leah weren't the only ones named. The author again references Tamar, saying, may your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah. There she is again. The implicit messages from chapter 3 now made explicit again and central to our story, central to the blessing being given. So I want to offer maybe another way to hear this or to read this. The blessing would go something like, may you be like the woman Tamar, who was folded into God's redemptive story, a foreigner made part of the family by Yahweh. And may you too know that God been suffering towards his redemptive goodness all your days. May you be like Tamar, marked by redemption and folded into God's plan for the world. Witnesses to resurrection, that's what they were. And these blessings only solidified that truth. They were witnesses to redemption outlasting suffering. They were witnesses to life outlasting death. And this moment, this is how the curtain closes on our second act, or our second scene in Act 4. Every great story, it ends with what writers call a denouement. Can you say denouement? I don't know what the word for good is in French all of a sudden. Anyway, I was going to say that to you. Anyway, it's a French word, and this French word means to untie. So it's the part of the story that's not just completed, but actually redeemed. All the things that had become entangled then become untangled. The denouement is the part of the movie or the book that you actually can't look away from. It's where the writer, if they're good at their craft, actually blows your mind, not only with a happy ending, but with the collision of a few storylines merging and exploding now with meaning and purpose and hope. The power of a denouement is not perfect language, it's not perfect writing or even perfect timing. Instead, it is that it is connected to what lives intrinsically in every human, which is the desire not just for a happy ending, but for a redeemed one. Redemption, that somehow, some way gives everything back that was lost, that gives everything to someone who has paid a price for it. And that, this concept of the denouement, brings us to our final scene today. A replay of redemption. Just when we think the story has ended, we see our author masterfully give us the ending we couldn't have dreamed up from the start. We wouldn't have thought of it. Untying redemption layer by layer. Look with me at verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And then he made love to her. Wow, wow, wow. And the Lord enabled her to conceive. And she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord who has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Now in our final moments of Act 4, the camera zooms from the cozied up Catherine Zeta-Jones, Costner, and the new baby back to Naomi, where our story started. And the author is about to pull back the curtain on the story as we thought we knew it. In verse 14, we are introduced to a replay, if you will, a retelling of chapter 1, but now through the lens of redemption, through the lens of what God has done amidst the mystery of Ruth's faithfulness in Naomi's journey. You'll remember that at the start of our story, we find in our opening scene, Naomi having lost not just her husband, but 2 sons. And if that wasn't crushing enough, she, because of the loss of these men in her life, she also lost her future. She lost her home. She lost her inheritance. She lost her livelihood. There she is in chapter 1, in the depth of grief and despair. And it was so powerful to her, it was so consuming to her that she demanded she be renamed, demanded that her life, because it had been flipped so upside down, could be called nothing else but bitter. Do you remember that? Naomi's pain at the beginning of the story was so great and so consuming that she didn't think this was just a circumstance or experience, but she had believed the lie that this is who she was. This is who she would only ever be. Have you ever felt that way? So marked by your pain and your grief that you feel like it has changed not only who you are on the inside, but how you show up and live in the world. Naomi's life had just been devastated by chaos and evil. Life outside of Eden for them meant that nothing would be untouched by the severity of suffering, brokenness, and death. This Bible story, it isn't a fairy tale, at least in its first chapter. It is more like a tragedy. Naomi had no hope that her life could change, no expectation that Yahweh's mercy was somewhere on the horizon, and yet it was. In verses 14 and 15, our author folds us into the denouement, beautifully connecting the losses of chapter 1 to the redemption in chapter 4. It looks something like this. In chapter 1, we see that Naomi lost her husband. And in chapter 4, we read that she was given a guardian redeemer who would restore provision and protection. In chapter 1, we see that she lost both of her sons. And in chapter 4, we see that she was given Ruth, a daughter-in-law who was, and don't miss this, better to her than 7 sons. That doesn't replace the loss of her sons, but there's something being signified here that we're meant to pay attention to. Finally, we see that there was a loss of her future in chapter 1 and her family name. All of it was at risk, and yet we see in chapter 4 a secured future and a name that would live on in the Messiah's genealogy. All of this moment in Act 4, it's meant to show us that Yahweh, the one who Naomi was certain in Act 1 had left her in her grief and pain and even afflicted her, was in fact working the whole time to bend her suffering towards his goodness all along. Everything terrible that happened in our prologue is now being reordered in redemptive love. And this, for us, the reader, is meant not just to give us a good feeling or a whisper of hope in our lives, but it is given to remind us and even to declare to us at a soul level that Yahweh is who he says he is and that he is doing the same thing in our lives. The language the author uses in this final dialogue, it invites us to consider who is and who has been redeeming Naomi's story. Is it Boaz who will sustain Naomi in her old age? Or is it Boaz's son? Is it Boaz or their son who is her guardian redeemer? Is it Boaz who's going to be famous throughout Israel? Or is it Yahweh? Yes, is the answer. Now, before we move on, there's one final thing that we need to name and see. It's really significant to this moment, really significant to us understanding the fullness and the breadth of the story. And it's really essential in understanding Naomi's redemption. In these final moments we're given as Ruth and Boaz get their happy ending and Naomi's worst moments are finding their way to resurrection, we as the audience both see and hear a familiar group of women enter the scene. And maybe you've already noticed, but they are the same group of women from chapter 1. Again, a correlation between chapter 1 and chapter 4. And it was they who Naomi lamented to. It was this group of women, this community, that said to each other, can this be Naomi? Marking and affirming the complexity of her situation. And now again in chapter 4, this little brood of women make their way onto the scene. And this community, this is the one that calls out and recognizes, as they recognized her suffering, her redemption also. And they do so seemingly before she does. Community, the people surrounding Naomi, the ones awake to her story, witnessing in real time both the tragedy and the redemptive work of God in her life. Unique in their perspective and their vantage point, they show up to the scene at just the right moment and they bless her. But notice that they didn't do it just by showering her a sweet little accolade or by saying something kind or by throwing her a great party when it was all said and done. Instead, they see and blessed her by naming her by what she couldn't see herself. In our text, it's wild to me that Naomi, after everything that had begun unfolding right before her in this moment, we find no dialogue from her. No eruption of praise or gratitude, though she might have felt it and been experiencing it. We don't see it here in the text. And so it's almost as though she still couldn't see fully what God had done or what God was doing, which makes this moment even more powerful to me because it was through these women and through their declaration of what they could see with their own eyes that Yahweh was actually able to show up to Naomi and say to her, I'm not punishing you, but I am restoring you. It was her community that traced God's redemptive story in her life. It was their perspective. It was their vantage point that she didn't have that helped her see what she could not see in her own pain and her own circumstances and her own devastation. Meaning, without them, she might not have been able to fully see what God had done. Her community spoke out what was true before she felt like it was true. Her community spoke out hope before she felt like she had any. Her community named her redemption before she felt redeemed. In this moment, when everything that was once tied up in tragedy became untied through Yahweh's mercy and redemption, it stands front and center to you and me. We'll stop here today because I'm sweating profoundly. I feel my hair going flat, and that's my cue. But I do want to end with this observation. We open this teaching series with heartbreak and loss, talking about the chaos of evil, of a world outside of Eden, and the world that we all live in. And while Naomi's suffering is unique in this story, all of us suffer pain and loss. All of us know deep disappointment and disillusionment in this broken, chaotic world that we find ourselves in. And I just want to say doesn't always have to be cosmic in nature. It can be small in nature, and that still affects us. But as I've been thinking about this story and what we're meant to take from it, I'm wondering that what we've been learning and hearing about these past few weeks, that if the tragedy of the story isn't that we will all face Naomi's chaos, but that not all of us will know Naomi's redemption. As we close out Act 4, I want to acknowledge, and I have to acknowledge, that you will at some point find yourself in Act 1. You will be battered around by chaos, experiencing the realities of life outside of Eden until Jesus comes back and makes it all new. You will experience death and abandonment and scarcity and loss and pain, but what we have to equally acknowledge when we sit in front of a book like this, a chapter like this, is if nothing else, this story reveals to us that with Yahweh, there is always, always, always redemption at work. God is moving on our behalf, even if we can't feel it or see it. So I have to ask, with that truth in our mind, what might be keeping you from finding yourself in Act 4? What would keep you from living and seeing and celebrating God's redemption the way He is and has worked even over the last week of your life to bring about goodness and redemption to you? And who do you have in your life that will help you trace God's theme of redemption in your own story? Back to Kevin McAllister, not Costner. Kevin, at the start of the movie, he wishes his family would disappear. He wishes to be left alone. He throws a tantrum, he yells at his mother in anger, and he stomps his way up to the attic. The next morning, when he realizes that what he wished for came true, we begin to see the movie unfold. We see Kevin move from joy to fear to fighting. And as he moves through these emotions, through the realities of his circumstances, we see him do all that he can do to survive, to make life feel normal again. Remember, he got the toothbrush and the Tide. But have you ever noticed that he does all of this, never really knowing if there's hope for things to change? Never really knowing if he actually wished his family away or if they just left him home alone. For approximately 8 days, at least that's what Wikipedia said, he seeks to find some meaning, to get his bearings in some way throughout the movie, while never knowing the whole time that his mom was fighting to get back to him, doing whatever it would take to see him again, to reassure him that she loved him. Though he was surrounded by the noise of his circumstances, she was steadied by her love for him, even more certain that she would do whatever it took to make things right again. In the final scene, and spoiler alert, if you haven't seen this, I can't help you. It's like 25 years old. This final scene, we see Kevin, after getting the bad guys arrested and making friends with the scary neighbor. We see him around the fireplace at his living room, sunlight beaming in and setting out stockings and gifts for his family who aren't there, wishing and hoping that he could know the joy he once knew. And just when we think it's over, the chaos has settled and everything seems okay, Kevin hears his name, hears his mom's voice call his name. And with just the mention of his name, we know that everything his circumstances told him, everything that he had lost, everyone that he had loved, every vision for how the future might look now was washed away as he was reminded at the mention of his name who he was and who had been fighting for him, who had been fighting to get back to him the whole time. It's his name. Someone speaking out who he really is that helped him remember and know that he was not what his circumstances reflected, even for that traumatic moment, but that he was something so much more. His mom knew the whole time what she was doing, what she would fight for until the end, even though he didn't. And in the final Kevin shout, we see him know what she was doing all along. Now I'm going to admit to you that is a bit of a silly way to explain all of this. But I do think it gives gravity to what we can walk away with today. Each of us, we live in the chaos of life outside of Eden. We've been learning that. But the hope and the promise we've been given in this story is that God is always fighting for us. He's always fighting for our good, fighting to redeem what the chaos or the enemy has stolen from us, whatever that might be. And that reality, that can and that does change everything about how we move through this life. The problem is that while that might be true, we know God is fighting for us. We know it here. Like Naomi, many of us, especially when we're in the thick of it, when the haze of pain and confusion and loss encompass us, we usually fail to see and honestly even believe that God is as good as we have known him to be even in the past. Painful circumstances, whether big or small, they have a way of disorienting us. Loss and pain, they are disorienting in nature. They are entities that live in contrast to our very design, which means that they have the power to flip upside down our affections or our sense of self and even our sense of God. So we will need help. Like Naomi, we will need help seeing what we cannot see. We will need help believing and trusting and seeing God amidst the chaos, especially when it feels like we can't find the path in front of us. Have you ever been in a place like that? Unable to see where God is bending your story towards his goodness. Have you ever been in a place and failed to see where God was at work or how he was redeeming something that felt very unredeemable? I have to guess that in a room this size, the answer is yes, at least for a few of us. And I know this might sound very simple, but I just want to say to those of you who are in this moment right now, you are not alone. You are not alone. All of us crazy beans in here, we're going through it too. And you are not alone. And the more we can be honest about how we actually feel, about the experience that's happening to us and around us, that's our pathway to knowing the reality of God with us. Community, the people around us are who God has set in place to give us help. It's a gift of God to have people around you, to have people who can give you perspective and a view on what God's doing outside of what you see or feel. Because God knows how hard it is. He hasn't left us without help. The community, the people of God He's put around you in this room and in small groups that happen all over the city and in every other space, it is God's witness to you that you are not alone and that He is at work. But the question you have to ask, the question I have to ask in light of that truth, which I love, that we all actually have to wrestle with today. This question, it's really twofold if I'm being totally honest. It's one, the question you have to sit with is, who have you actually let in that you could say in the honesty of the chaos of this life, of the journey you're on right now, that you could honestly say to them, don't call me Eden, call me Mara. In other words, who can you or maybe have you let into your life who know that you, all of you, the whole of you, even in the midst of suffering and pain, even when it's ugly, even when you feel like you're denying God with what you're speaking, even when you feel humiliated by what's taking place, who have you let in to see you to that degree? And the second part of that is, who are you fighting for? Who are you close enough to actually see and to declare the realities of God at work in their life? To see and declare to them the ways that God is redeeming them, the way that God is redeeming their story, the way that God is picking up the broken pieces and making them beautiful again. Who are you fighting for? Who are you close enough to live this way as a reflection of the truth, of the goodness and redemption of God Himself? If the answer to one or both of those questions for you is no one in your community or in your life, then today the invitation for you is to ask God for it. Simple. And maybe you're like, that's the best I got. And that's where we should start. Ask God for it and count the cost. Be willing to follow Him all the way when He gives the gift. 2, also maybe, at the same time that you ask God for this, would you consider what has been keeping you from being available to these kind of relationships? What has kept you from being known or knowing others this way? For a lot of us, we are living in a world of competing priorities, both internally and externally. We've got a lot of stuff going on. And maybe for you, the priorities of your life or of this season are more external. Maybe you have an overcommitment to work or your vocation. Maybe you're staying late at the office or giving more time to projects than you actually are to people. Maybe you're prioritizing what you do rather than who you are. Or maybe for you, it's just easier to keep relationships external, like surface level. It's easier to keep relationships that demand only part of you, not all of you. And some of you are very good at this. I'm just gonna be totally honest. Those people, not to judge all the Southern people, but you're good at this. And it's a problem. Maybe it's easier for you, even though you may use the language of vulnerability and openness, maybe it's still easier for you to keep things more casual and non-committal. To keep relationships in the safe zone, to choose relationships that won't fatigue you because you don't want to be taxed by somebody else, or to choose relationships that disappoint you. You don't want that. So you just keep yourself externally aware and managing what's happening in your world. Or maybe for you, it's more internal. Maybe the fear of being known, and I just want to use this word delicately but powerfully as I can, the pride of being exposed in your pain is what keeps you from living in this kind of community. That's me. The ego that says they won't understand and they can't hold this for me and it's too complex and they'll probably mess it up and make it more work for me. Or they'll surely think less of me if they fill in the blank. Maybe that's what's holding you back. Or maybe it's fear. Fear of things being like they once were, when you did have community and things were great, but then you were injured or hurt by that community. Or there are people who said they would show up and then they didn't show up. And the thought of experiencing that again, it pushes you away of wanting to give yourself to this kind of relationship or to these kind of people. I just want to say, whatever it is for you, if you're on this earth and you have a pulse and you're trying to follow Jesus, there is no competing priority. Nothing that is more important or essential for you than community. And I'm with you when I say that sometimes that is so annoying. But early on in the scriptures, we were reminded we are not God. We need others, including God, but we need both to be who it is and to walk faithfully in the way that God has made us to walk. And let me say something just real quick. The gift of that is that God never invites us into something that's not good. And not just like, oh, that was suffering for goodness. Get out of here. Good like it's fun and it tastes good. And it feels good. It's good for us. So the invitation on offer, this thing that we have to fight for, it's not going to lead, it may come with pain and layers and complications, but in the end, it's good. There's a promise of goodness in it. We need others to help us on the journey. That's the bottom line. We need others to help us untangle the lies of the enemy. And some of you need that today. We need others to stay awake and to be curious about what God is doing in our lives and how he is bringing goodness to us. We need this. We need others so that we can know the goodness and power and life of God in our lives. And we need this if we want to make it to Act 4. There are no exceptions to the chaos of life. I've said that this morning. No exceptions to the rule of pain and brokenness. All of us know it. Pastors and people alike. And over the last few weeks, I've been reflecting on this concept of needing other people, the vulnerability of people seeing you in your pain, and I could write you a really great community guide about it. And I can hold this theologically in my mind and present to you at a decent level how to hold it for yourself. But I'm holding it differently in this season, not because of any of those reasons or because I have to do any of those things for my job, but because life has been painful and hard. And I wish I could tell you it's just been this month, but it hasn't. It's been this whole dang year. And I wish I wasn't telling you that. I don't want to tell you that. And also, I hate to tell you this, but I'm pretty sure this entire teaching series was for me. So be blessed. I was in Elders Spiritual Direction. We do this every week with each other. And this past time was my time to share. And for the first time in months, if not probably closer to a year, I was able to fully say that I have felt the reality of the Mara name. I feel like life and not just circumstances have been bitter for me this year. And after sharing like we do, we sat in silence, waiting on the Holy Spirit, and I just felt hot tears streaming down my cheeks. And I just kept my eyes closed because it felt safer to do that in my vulnerability. And I heard a voice say, what if in this very moment, God is redeeming everything this last year has taken? And immediately I hated that question. And I felt defense rise up, like, oh yeah, completely. Ugh. So mature. That question, it stayed in my mind. Question in the moment, it didn't help me with my pain, didn't satiate the ache and the burden I was feeling in front of my friends, but it did shape my imagination for the rest of the week. And then that week turned into 2 weeks. And here I am today, holding that same question before God. What if he was? What would that mean if God was redeeming everything I lost this year, face by face, sickness by sickness, tragedy by tragedy? What if God was redeeming that right now? What would that mean? And how would that change my view of God, who I have felt so wounded by? And how would it change where my grief went and what it meant? And how would that change what I believed about God and myself? Community. The people around us with a different vantage point. That is what is essential for the journey. And God has given us the gift of it. But even more so, he has given himself through it. If only we'll open our lives to it. So one more time, I'm going to ask you, who have you let in that you can say in the honesty of chaos, don't call me Eden, call me Mara? And who and what